that I'm selective with, it's like I want a specific topic and I don't care who the guest is. With Indie Hackers, I like Cortland's interview style. I like trust him as an interviewer, and there's just like it's one of the best places for people who are like building online to find out their thoughts. And so it's a great like bucket for that. And so I'll go through, and I saw Julian Shapiro, and I've always thought of him since I've been aware of him for the past few years. And he's just, I think, one of the like most brilliant minds in marketing, and especially for like SaaS marketing online. And like
Yeah.
everything he writes is amazing. And I'd never heard him on a podcast before. I found out he was Canadian as well, but now lives in the States. Didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was like, oh, I've never heard him speak on anything. And he, like, everything he does is like this podcast. He like writes one blog post every like 18 months, and it's just a monster, but it's like that one thing. And I think he does some other stuff too with his team, but it's like the ones that I remember that he's talked about this before. And so I was like, oh, here's like new Julian stuff, and it's kind of hard to get that. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, I like gotta listen to this. And there was maybe 3 episodes on Indie Hackers, and then one of those they talked about this new podcast, and I was like, well, of course I'm subscribing.
Yes, yes. And I just gotta apologize to the YouTube live people. I did everything right except for click start stream. And so I just realized that now. So sorry. There is going to be recording. So you did just miss like the best stuff, and I'm sorry. I had it live on my Twitter profile, but this is being recorded. Don't worry. We were just talking about what makes somebody subscribe to a show. And this is why I really want to introduce this concept of jobs to be done to folks. Jobs to be done in the business world is become a popular framework for understanding what motivates people to do anything. And in the business world, we often use it to describe what motivates people to buy something. And I think, Jeremy, you'll agree. Like the difference between getting somebody to buy something from you and the difference between getting them to actually subscribe to your show and listen, it's actually very similar. Would
Yeah.
you agree or no?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I mean, in some ways, I could see it being harder even. Like, there's no
Mm-hmm.
financial cost to it, but there is attention cost. Like, I think like this is the part of jobs to be done is thinking about like what we're spending here. And so like this idea is that we hire products and services and people and content to do this job for us. And what we spend might be different in each of those scenarios. Sometimes it's money, other times it's attention, it's
Yeah.
time, whatever that is. And so I think thinking about getting somebody to listen to your show on social or whatever it is, like that's a transaction. And I think that you need to think, oh, okay, well, if I realize it's a transaction, transactions are an exchange of value. So like somebody's giving me something and they're getting something in return. So we have to respect what our listeners are like paying for or paying with, which is their time or
Yeah.
attention. That could be, they could spend that on anything else. They could go and like have access to the whole Disney or Netflix catalog and be spending their time there. So like, why are they spending it with us instead of that Star Wars? I'm a huge Star Wars
Yes.
fan. So, it's a pretty high bar.
Well, and this comes up so often because, of course, all of us as podcasters want more listeners. That's what we all want, even if we don't admit it. We all want somebody listening to the show, and we want that number to be increasing because we're putting a lot of time into this. We're putting a lot of our creativity into this, and it just feels good to have an
Mhm.
audience and a growing audience. What's difficult is taking yourself out of the creator's shoes and putting yourself in the audience's shoes and going, well, why would anybody listen to this show? What other options do they have? Um, how are they going to hear about it? And then what is the on ramp to them actually getting my show in their podcast player, in the place where they listen, trying it out? And then what's the on ramp to them becoming a regular listener if that's, the goal? And I think we're going to take people through a variety of things. One is just the concept of the show itself, what makes a good show in terms of the idea, how to make that compelling, what you should do before you launch a podcast, and then what can you do if you've already launched a podcast? Because I know there's a lot of people here in the chat. We've got a lot of folks talking, interacting. This is great, actually. And they've got their shows, and they have existing shows they want more listeners for. But as your homework today, everybody who's watching, go and do some research on jobs to be done. You can start with Creighton Christensen's book. He's now sadly passed away, but a Harvard researcher who wrote a book called Competing Against Luck. But the idea that any listener is hiring your podcast to do a job in their life is just so fundamental. And once I understood that, it helped me craft a show on a variety of levels. So we hire podcasts on a general level to do all sorts of things. Distract me while I'm driving my car to work because the commute is boring. Entertain me while I'm taking the dog for a walk. Make doing the dishes less boring. Help me to feel connected relationally to somebody else, somewhere else in the world. Like I said with Mark Maron, I'm just always checking in on him. And I think understanding these jobs to be done on a general level and then sharpening them up to the point where it relates to your show. So there are certain shows I listen on my way down to the office as I'm walking to the office because I'm hiring them to get me thinking about business stuff. They're business podcasts. They're fellow bootstrappers. There's people operating software businesses. And listening to, for example, Brian and Jordan on the Bootstrapped Web podcast, listening to them gets me hyped up. It gives me ideas for my day. That's what I'm hiring that podcast to do. At the end of the day, I might listen to something that kind of, calms me down or distracts me or is entertaining. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that piece?
I mean, so the clearest, you gave some great examples there. The clearest one to me of a job to be done is this has become a whole genre, is the the sleep aid podcasts. It's so clear. The reason you listen is to put you to sleep. Like that is and they're very good. I mean, the good ones that have grown are and it's kind of obvious in that case that they would put that in the description. Like it's you can kind of get into some funny copywriting stuff too. Like the podcast that the point is you don't hear the end of it, or whatever it is, where it's kind of the podcast that's not meant to be listened to, or whatever it is. I've seen some clever kind of copywriting like that, but they know that the whole point here, I need to make this so boring but minimally engaging so that people aren't, their mind isn't wandering, but it's not interesting. And so there's such clarity there on this job to be done that and obviously the listeners are very aware as well. That is one of the clearest examples that comes to mind of somebody's listening to this not to do anything except to fall asleep, and they're never going to listen during the daytime or anything like that.
Yeah. And I think people can see that this is why getting to craft a show from the beginning with these ideas in mind is so helpful. Another great example of a job to be done show is the Mindset Mile, where she challenges you to run 1 mile a day for 30 days. And what are you hiring the podcast to do? She's like, I'll be with you in your ears every single day. So I'm going to publish an episode every day. You wake up with me. We're both going to go for a run. We're going to run 1 mile and we're going to do it together. Well, that whole concept of a show, that happens from ground level. You're building this up and going, what are people hiring the show to do? What's going to compel them to actually join me on the podcast and actually listen on a regular basis? So the unfortunate answer sometimes is that you might need to launch a few shows before you find a concept that really works and resonates. And my friend Peldy says the easiest way to market something is to build something people want. And it's unfortunate that it's really difficult to apply marketing strategies to a podcast that nobody really wants. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, then there's also the element to that where I talk to a lot of people too, who, especially in the entertainment style, if the job to be done is to entertain people, there is certainly people want to be entertained, but you also then have to balance that with what is the competition out there. And there are a lot of fantastic shows that are produced by big networks and media companies who, what they do for a living across, podcasting is one part of what they do, but going back to this example of Disney, their whole business is telling compelling stories and entertaining people in all these different mediums. And so if you're looking to get into the entertainment space, then you're thinking like, okay, well, the bar's pretty high there. And so I think there's also this element of, maybe that is where you want to compete, and maybe you are a fantastic storyteller and you have all the tools available, and like this is a great place for you to be. And you can also niche down
Yeah.
to a specific audience, which can help you. But there's also this element of like with jobs to be done of like, where's an underserved audience who like there aren't really that many options for, and I'm interested in this as well, and I could really create a show there. And I mean, it depends on your motivations too. Like, do you just want to create a thing that is fulfilling to you, and that's fine, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. And unless you start to ask like, why aren't I growing, or how can I grow more, then you have to start negotiating with like, okay, well, how do I align what I want to do with what the audience wants? And then if it's,
Yeah.
for a business, then you really want to be clear on like, okay, if I'm trying to get my customers attention, what are the jobs they need that to be done that are not being done adequately by other shows out there, or how can I kind of do a different job there?
Yeah. And maybe in the chat here, we've got a bunch of people in live chat. Just in chat, I would like some honest answers about what your goal is for your show. And you could say, just be honest. Like, I want to get this many listeners. I want to make some money on this eventually. So get enough people to, actually have some ads. I want to do this to be better known in my industry. Just put in the chat here, what is your goal for your podcast? Like, why are you doing it? And I think that question, and being honest about it, being brutally honest about it, is kind of the key, because if not every vehicle will get you there,
Yeah.
right? And so if your goal is to reach 100,000 listeners a month, there are certain topics, there are certain categories that just won't work for that. You may need to hire production help. You may need to get really good at producing podcasts and actually crafting stories at a level, at an NPR kind of level. And so that's one level, right? And on another level, it might be just, I just want to explore this topic that I'm excited about. And I do want more listeners, but if I could go from 100 to 200 listeners, that would be amazing. And being honest about that and realistic, I think, is part of the key. Not to say, my first podcast out of the gate, I'm going to try to get 1,000 listens per episode. That might happen, but it's something like the top 20% of all podcasts get 1,000 plus. So like 80% of podcasts don't even get to 1,000 downloads per episode, right?
Yeah.
Anything else to add about goals, do you think?
We could get what I really like. So I like business. I like startups. I like all this stuff, even though I run a business. I don't have a startup per se, or at least in like the tech sense. But I think there's so much to learn. Like, one of the challenges and opportunities in podcasting is that it's kind of like underdeveloped when it comes to marketing, because you just didn't need to like do it for a long time. But like, all this information is out there, especially like I love reading about startup marketing, and it applies, we've talked about this before, that it applies one-to-one to podcasting. You just replace business with podcasting and almost everything applies. And there's some interesting ways that like, there's obviously, with a lot of money in startups, like a lot of people have done a lot of research about how do you actually grow and gain traction with a business. And pretty much all of that applies to podcasting. And so like, one of my favorite things, which is, you hear it, like every business knows that this is a crucial milestone for them, is achieving product market fit. And I don't think anybody really talks about that much. Like, it's starting to make its way into podcasting, but it's this podcast market fit. And I like to take that even like one step further and say like creator podcast market fit, because you can like build a show that your audience wants and you can hate it. And I've done that and I couldn't sustain it, even though it was like actually working for the business and showing a lot of good signs. I was like, I don't enjoy making this, and like I'm 30 episodes in and I can't do another like 200 or whatever it is that like where I know it's like really going to be getting big results. And I compared that to like how I felt writing both of my newsletters, and I was like, this is misaligned. Like, I don't have fit with this show. Like, I need to end this, even though the audience likes it and I got great feedback. I got to take a break, and like I'll come back with another show later that actually has that fit with me and the audience as well.
Yeah. I have a post called "You Want More Than Product Market Fit," And for podcasting, you want more than podcast market fit. And I think the foundation is you want podcaster audience fit first. So, like you said, it's no fun making a show for people that you don't really dig, right?
Yeah.
You really want to dig the topic and the people who are attracted to that topic. It's like, and this is sometimes counterintuitive. Like, in my early 20s, I started a snowboard shop because I loved snowboarding, and I thought, oh, I'd love to sell snowboards to other snowboarders. But it turns out I don't actually like those people as customers, you know? And the same can be true for listeners. So have podcaster listener fit first, like podcaster audience fit first, and then move on to podcaster fit. So is this the right type of show for me? Like, if I don't like scheduling things on my calendar, maybe an interview show is not the best fit for me as a podcaster. And then you get down to podcast market fit or podcast audience fit, which is this the right show for this audience competing with everything else this audience has available to them? And this is why making something good is so hard.
Yeah.
Because we have to create alignment in all of these things, right? I have to love the audience. I have to love the type of show that I'm doing. And then the audience has to love the show that I'm producing. Everything has to get aligned. And then, then there's still all of the other stuff, like the timing and, luck and all those other variables. So it's not easy. And I just want to acknowledge, if you've ever struggled with this, that's normal. It is a struggle. And it's why it sometimes takes a few attempts. It's why I'm a big advocate at create a show and do it for a while. And then if it's not serving you, if it's not right, and you don't feel like it has the potential to grow, maybe you should switch to something else. There's obviously a tension there. Sometimes it takes some time, but
yeah. So I mentioned the show that I had done. This was a couple of years ago. I guess I ended it last year. I started it the year before, did 30 episodes. And going into it, like, one of the reasons it had been 3 years probably since I had a previous show before that. And like, I'm in the podcasting industry, so everybody always asks like, oh, what's your show about? And I'm like, oh, I don't really have one. Always felt kind of embarrassed about that. And then I also thought, like, as a podcast guy, like, when I launch it and when I produce it, like, it has to be incredible. Like, it felt like there was so much pressure on it. And so I did eventually launch this like pretty high production quality show that was kind of like there was like narrative, like interstitial breaks and things like that in an interview, but just with one person. But it was like clearly the best, highest produced show in the niche. And the niche at the time was like online. It was for online wellness business owners, teaching them marketing, because most of our, just through referrals and stuff like that, entirely unplanned, most of our clients for the production company at the time were in the wellness space. And so I was kind of like resisted niching for years. And then finally was like, might as well just lean into it and do this, even though here again, this call back to what you said, it's not the audience I would choose to serve necessarily.
yeah.
And so I started the show and it was like going great, was getting great feedback on it. Had a couple people who were like reaching out about becoming clients, opened up a bunch of opportunities, got some like speaking gigs with like pretty quickly. All of this happened. And when it came time, when I started to like feel like, I don't know if this is the show for me, one of the pieces of resistance was like, well, I know podcasts take a long time to grow. And also, again, I'm like the podcast guy. I can't like pod fade on this. But honestly, like I recorded like a wrap up episode. It became so clear that like this was not part of my plan personally, and got great feedback on the wrap up episode. People like were like, wow, that was so interesting to hear how you thought through ending this thing. Cause like we all have things that we're doing. We don't know why we keep going or if it's time to quit or whatever. And so that was still a helpful episode for people. But I look back on ending that show as like the best thing I've probably done in the past few years, maybe the past like 5 years creatively, because as soon as I ended that, it was like realizing like, oh, I put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours into creating this show, and like months and months and months of pre-production and like all this stuff. So there's all this sunk cost, and being able to say like, yeah, I'm done with it. That was fine. I did it. I'm done with it. That just like gave me so much energy going forward to be like, oh, I can start and end anything. And like, I
Yes.
know that like I can't predict before I actually get into it whether this is going to be a
Mhm.
good fit. Like, okay, so I'm going to start a new show maybe, and I'll do 3 episodes. And if I wouldn't wait as long that time. If I felt after 3 episodes like this isn't the show for me, I'd had no problems now being like, okay, well, I've got enough other ideas that like this one's going out the door, and let's go on to the next one. And so I think like
Yes.
sometimes getting yourself over the hurdle the first time and just saying like, I know I've put a ton of time and energy and like my heart into this, and it's not getting results, or I don't feel like it's the right show for me. If you can like get yourself to the point where you end that, it actually opens up a lot of opportunities in the future to just start like testing things out and seeing like one of those is going to really click for you and your audience, and you probably can't predict that beforehand, and then you know like, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like, and I'm doubling down on this one.
Yeah. Well, this is a good segue into, let's first talk about how to generate good ideas for a show. What are some things you're advising people to do when it comes to coming up with a concept? What are some practical things people can do to find good ideas, to generate good ideas for a podcast that might have the potential to get thousands of downloads per episode?
Yeah, so I would. The first thing is just like paying attention. I think that this is like you can teach yourself marketing just by observing the stuff you like that resonates with you, that gets you to like click a link online, or the shows you listen to. Like this question we started with, like why did you? What's the last show you started listening to, you subscribed to, and what was the process to get there? Where did you hear about it?
Yeah.
What was compelling about it to you? What keeps you coming back? And you can do this for all the shows in your feed, and you can start to see some patterns emerge that you can then start to apply to your own show and be more intentional with. And so like
Yeah.
there's a great newsletter actually called Formats Unpacked, I think. It's out of this agency in the UK, and I can't remember the well, I think it's written by a different person on the team each week, but it essentially breaks down an interesting format or like kind of show concept across podcasts, TV, newsletters, like all of these different media, and it breaks down like why this is interesting. And we've talked a little bit about this before. Is this idea of tension, where these two ideas that like maybe shouldn't go together. And I think when you find something like that, or it's not that they're like necessarily in opposition, but they don't necessarily make sense. And so I think like when you start to notice that, like the one that comes to mind as like a classic like interesting format is Hot Ones on YouTube. And so it's for
Mm.
anybody who hasn't seen it, Sean Evans is the host, and he walks a celebrity guest through a series of questions, and for each question they eat a progressively hotter hot wing. And so it's this
Yeah.
like what do hot wings have to do with interviews, and yet it's been packaged so well that you like the wings get spicier as the questions do, kind of is one of the phrases that he uses, I think. And so it's like
Yeah.
this thing that you're like, why are these two, they shouldn't do anything together, but it's become such a compellingly packaged show that you're like, oh, this it makes total sense, like I totally get why this works. And that's a kind of
Yeah.
like gimmicky, like not every show needs to be like that, but I think it's like looking for how can you bring things together that aren't just kind of like basic. Like I think a lot of people start out with like a basic idea, which is where most ideas start, but you have to find some way to like spice that up, and it's probably by bringing in like outside influences that are things that you really like drive you as a person and a creator, and weaving them in a way that feels entirely natural. And that's when people start to like really take notice a lot of times, I think. And
Yeah.
it's because and you also get to this point where like nobody else could possibly create that thing, because it's like these two passions that you have that you've kind of seamlessly woven together, because that's the lens through which you see the world, and nobody else really does.
Yeah. We have some people disagreeing with us, which is fine. One person says if you're designing a show based on potential listenership volume, I'd say that's a pretty big red flag. I don't know if I agree with that. I think you can. Obviously, there has to be many other factors. It's not just one thing. But when you're starting a business, for example, it's okay to say, does this concept have what it takes to get me to where I want to go? And if part of your metric for success, part of where you want to get to is I want to have a show with a couple thousand downloads per episode, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Personally, I prefer doing those shows more than I do shows that have 100 listeners per episode. And I think that's fine. Now, of course, there has to be all sorts of other things there. It has to align with my personality, what I'm good at, my strengths, what I bring to the table, what the audience wants. All of those things can be true, but there's no shame in creating a show that you think may reach a certain level of popularity. I think that's fine. And of course, if all you're doing is you're just in a thrashing kind of way saying, well, I'm just going to get to a show that's getting 10,000 downloads per episode. Of course, that's not healthy, but we're really talking about a holistic approach here, which includes any goals you have around how many people might be in the audience, right? When I started speaking publicly, I started with local meetups and there was 100 people there. And then I moved up to a bit bigger conferences and there was maybe 200 or 300 people there. And then to the point where I was speaking to audiences of 1,000. And it's okay to step your way up and to enjoy the process of speaking to more people even. Mm-hmm. It's fun. It's part of the reason we're in broadcast media, right? Yeah, so I think everything you said there is so on. And I think it's also fine to experiment a little bit. And this is where talking about what you can do before you launch a show, like what are the things you can do before you launch a podcast that can help the podcast succeed. I've often said that the most potent time for marketing is before you launch. You're building up anticipation. You're able to collect emails. You can have a waiting list. You can publish a trailer to Apple and Spotify and get people to add it to their podcast player now and share it with their friends even. And the mistake I see people do is they record a bunch of episodes and then they wait until the launch day and then they publish 3 episodes at once. And then there's crickets because people haven't been anticipating the show. There's no buildup. So what are some things you think folks can do to create some of that buildup and at the same time maybe be testing their concept to see if does this show have some legs? Is there something resonant about this topic? What have you been advising folks to do there?
Yeah, I think that this is again going back to this other world of like specifically the indie hackers community is like super, pro build in public, this phrase. And yes. I don't know that that's so much in the podcast community, but essentially like Austin Kleon wrote a book about the show your work essentially is the same topic, which is if anybody hasn't read it, like go read it, go read the whole series of his books. They're easy reads. They're like beautifully illustrated and they're just fun and uplifting, kind of like encouraging companions as you do creative work. But the idea is like every day you're just like sharing a bit of what you worked on that day, pulling back the curtain a little bit and showing like, hey, I'm like working on new cover art and like here's some options. And I think part of it's like a way to get people just aware of what you're doing. And so they can see like, oh, Justin's creating a new show and like that's some really cool design. I can see what the topic's going to be. But it's also like they get this bond with you of like whether or not they're going to be listeners. You're not having this like potentially months-long stretch of like sharing a little bit every day or every week, however long it is, that they start to realize, okay, Justin's doing this thing and actually I'm not into this topic, but I know somebody else who's gonna like love it. So maybe I should like loop them in now. And this is one of those ways where like the longer you plan in advance, the more content you have to share kind of before you're almost overloaded with the regular production schedule. And so you're like always doing little things. You can just record a little like Loom video behind the scenes or screenshots, just like do a daily update of like, hey, this is what I worked on today. And you could position it as like, I want to launch the show. Like this is me like holding myself accountable. So I'm going to share a little bit every day. And if you want to get more advanced, you could even like have a private community. I know our mutual friend Jay Klaus did this when he was building. It's kind of like a meta thing where he was building his paid community, and then he had a different community of people who like he shared all the behind the scenes stuff with of like how he was building the paid community. Got a little inception action going on. But yes, I think like that there's this awareness element to that, but then there's also this element of like actually getting feedback and helping people shape the show, because I think like one of the things we all need to realize about our ideas is like we don't really know how, like the point of creating a podcast or any kind of content online is that it interacts with other people. And so we can only know like how that idea sits with us. And it's not until we actually get it in front of people that we know like, oh, like this actually works, or we need to do these tweaking. And so I think it's a lot smarter. You can save yourself a lot of time if you start putting the ideas out there early and seeing like what gets people excited. If nobody's commenting on anything and you're like getting it in front of people who should like you think like I'm creating the show for these people specifically, but like why is nobody like liking a single post or commenting or anything? Like, is something wrong? And maybe that's when you want to start like one-on-one outreaching to people and say like, hey, I'm doing this show, like, oh, is this something you would listen to? And like be honest with me, like right now, if you could sign up right now and listen, like, and like look for their like, listen to what they tell you, but look if their like eyes light up and if they're like, whoa, that sounds like just the show I've been waiting for, like that's a good sign. If they're like, yeah, you know, I'd totally listen to that show, it's like, oh, okay, I don't know if they're being fully honest with me right here. And through that
Yeah.
kind of like feedback process, you can ask for feedback directly and say like, hey, which of these cover arts do you like better? And you can also just like listen in to like, how are people responding to this? What are the conversations that this is bringing up? And you know, that can kind of shape how you create the show going forward from there.
Totally. I love that idea of, I mean, a lot of what we have to think about as indie creators is what advantages do we have that NPR doesn't? What
Hmm.
advantages do we have that Gimlet doesn't? And one of the advantages as an indie creator is that we are small.
Hmm.
Hey, I'm the underdog. Hey, it's just me. Hey. And so, you know, a lot of these big media companies, they have to look buttoned up and professional. They have to have a launch schedule. They have to hide the whole process and then,
Hmm.
you know, do a big splash release. They can't share the behind the scenes, but we can. This is our advantage as an indie podcaster. And so partnering with the potential audience and saying, hey, everybody, it's me, Justin. I'm just a guy on the internet. I'm really interested in this topic and I'm thinking about launching a show. If you're interested in this topic too, can you sign up for this email list? I just am going to be pitching ideas and helping to craft the show with a trusted group of people. You're inviting people to be a part of the process with you. You're inviting people to be early fans. Um, and that collaboration between you and the potential audience is huge. And the big media companies can't do this. They can't be as honest as you can. They can't be as vulnerable as you can. And I would encourage people to check out things like, even outside of podcasting, I think there's so much inspiration. My friend Adam Wathen does these updates. He's a software developer. He sells this thing called Tailwind, but he's just great at just saying, "Hey, here's some honest background on trade-offs and things I'm working on and things I'm thinking about," and inviting the audience to partner with him, and you know, ask them questions. Should we choose this cover art or this cover art? You know, and I think a lot of folks start, I mean, the bare minimum is to have a coming soon page for your podcast,
Hmm.
right? Like, here's a thing that's coming soon. You can listen to a trailer. You can subscribe right now because I've actually recorded and published the trailer and submitted it to Apple, Spotify, and everything so that you can actually go and find it right now and share it with a friend and get notified by email. But you can really augment this by sharing personally from your life. Hi, I've been in the restaurant industry for 10 years and COVID killed my company. You know, like already this is vulnerable, this is real, this is raw. And then inviting people to say, "Hey, I'm starting a podcast on what you do. How do you emerge from the ashes of COVID?" And so if you're in the same place as me, sign up and let's go on this journey together. I think that opportunity is something that so many people are missing. They want to be in these
Hmm.
creative silos. They want to have everything dialed. I'm going to present this perfectly formulated broadcast for everybody. No, be raw, be vulnerable, be real. That's your advantage as an indie.
Yeah, and I would say too, the other thing that is a prerequisite that not everybody has, and so if we're talking about things to do before you launch, I think if you're like starting to think about a show and you don't have your like whole launch plan, you don't have episodes lined up or anything like that yet, like the first thing you should do is if you don't have the community, or you're not already engaging with the community that you want the show to be for, like that should be top of your list of like, find out where these
Yeah.
people are. Like define that and then find it, because that's a challenge that I can hear people saying, like, okay, well, yeah, I can build in public, but I don't have anybody who follows me, or like, I still don't have any audience there. But actually, you can start building that audience by going and just being as a part of, a member of like one of these communities. And
Yeah.
it's easier if you're like, it's always easier if you're doing like an educational or like a show for your business a lot of times. Whereas if
Yeah.
it's like an entertainment style show, that's a bit different. But like there are still, subreddits and like things, there are forums where there are people who just love podcasts that like, if
Yeah.
of that style, like if you're doing, a narrative show or true crime or something like that, there are communities all around the internet of people who love those shows. So go just like start listening in on the conversations, engage in the conversations, and at some point be like, hey, I'm starting a thing about, a show about this topic over here. Is this like, does anybody have any good advice? Has anybody started a show before? What should I be thinking about? Are there similar shows to this? And people, you just start like, you're not promoting it necessarily. You're just doing research and getting feedback and getting people engaged without feeling like, without them feeling like you're selling to them. And that's where you start to build up these people who actually like want to see you succeed because they've been with you since day one. And so 6 months later, when the show launches, you've got like, maybe it's like 15 or 20 people, but if each of those 15 or 20 people knows a couple other people who are into that show already, you've already put yourself in front of a larger audience than most people who are starting when they are not part of a community. They don't know anyone who would be into their topic.
Yes. Yeah. Here's another trick from the startup community that relates exactly to that. My friend Heaton Shaw is great at this. Here's a tweet. And he just does these research projects, these public research projects all the time. Hey, do you use Slack? I'm doing some research and you can help by taking this survey. Podcasters, we could do this for new shows. Hey, are you the kind of person who listens to this show, and this show? I'd love to hear from you. I'm doing this survey, and link to the survey. And you can send basically what I call a podcast listener survey. Now, you should do this for your own show if you already have a show. But Reform actually just published this template that anybody can use. I can link to it. I don't know how I'm going to link to this. Maybe go to transistor.fm/newsletter, and I'll share some of the links in a follow-up email. But, you can ask questions and say, hey, I'm doing a research project on people who listen to 99% Invisible, 20,000 Hertz, and Here Be Monsters. And then you just write all that down and then just ask them these questions about, how did you hear about the podcast? What makes you keep listening? Now you've got all of this information that you can use for your own podcast, right? And now you also have potentially some email addresses for people who are also interested in that show or those types of shows. So things like this, I think, can be really helpful. And it's surprising how often folks will, Heaton had 55 retweets on this. People often share these kinds of things. And if they're passionate about a topic or a show, they might share it for you, right?
Yeah, I just shared a template as well for a podcast-specific listener survey that you can do. It would be more like once you have your show running already. So that's a Notion link there. But I think like if you're in the community, one of the things I like to think about is when launching a new show is like, we think like, okay, we want podcast listeners, but really like we're all creators and potentially brands at some point. And like, hopefully like thinking about if we're successful with our show, probably that means expanding just beyond the podcast. Maybe we want to have like, even if it's just like merch or other products or things like that. If we are, maybe we start a newsletter or something like that, where we're also selling like ad revenue on that. Maybe we do have a business already. So there's like probably going to be other opportunities that we want to expand into. If we look at like, if this went perfectly, like what would be my dream like for this podcast to lead to? Probably there's a larger brand there at some point. And so I think it's helpful thinking about that from the start and being like, okay, well, like at some point I probably want to grow my like Twitter following too, or LinkedIn or whatever it is. Like, so I can actually start doing that well before I launch or when I'm still small. And I think like that's where you can actually get a lot more traction, because almost any other platform out there is more discoverable than podcasting. And so it's going to be more easy to get attention almost anywhere else. And like start that early. And it's going to take time to like get people back to the podcast. But like you can build, it's much easier to get 1,000 Twitter followers than it is to get 1,000 podcast listeners in most cases. And so like start finding those people and build up that community. And it doesn't need to be you just like promoting your podcast all the time. Like actually, you know, be a community with those people and be a contributor, and as well as like someone who's learning from that community.
Yeah. And this is why it really is everything that leads to a show that has thousands of listeners. It's layers on layers on layers. And I don't want to be too cynical or negative, but if you're launching a show for a particular type of person, but you have no idea how you might reach that type of person, that is a bit of a red flag that maybe you haven't done enough work yet investing in that community, investing in that audience, building relationships, building a network. I think if you're launching a show on a topic, you should have at least, I would say at least 10 people that you could write a personal email to and say, hey, it's Justin. As you know, I've been a part of this community for quite a while. You and I have talked about it, and I'm launching a podcast on September 28th on this topic. The trailer's out right now. Here's a tweet. I would really appreciate it if you could share this tweet or share the show with other people like us. And every podcast I've done, except for the first two that failed, the ones that did well, Product People, Build and Launch, Mega Maker, and Build Your SaaS, I wrote, and sometimes like dozens and dozens of personal emails saying, hey, this is coming up. I would really appreciate your help and support. And here's the link. Here's something you can share. Those could be your first 10 listeners. Those are the people who are going to tell other people about your show. And so make sure that you're building your show on top of a firm foundation, that you've already created those connections, that you already have people you could talk to.
Yeah, that was the exact same thing I did. And I know I've heard Nathan Barry talk about, he's the founder of ConvertKit, talk about every newsletter that he's ever done. Always started with like personal emails, like the first, 10 certainly, but like you could get your first 100 people just by one-to-one outreach. You could get your first 1,000 listeners by just meeting people and like one-to-one doing that. And I think like that's actually what I like about that is it feels like a lot of work, but you know what to do. Like it's not this complex thing about you need to game the algorithms and like figure this thing out. It's like, oh, I just need to like put myself in places where I'm going to be meeting people who are interested in my topic and making friends with them and contributing to the community, getting people to like know my name, not just like posting my link, but like actually getting to know people. And at some point saying like, hey, have you ever listened to my show by chance? Like no pressure. If not, I'm curious, like what isn't appealing about it? And if so, like here's an episode I think you'd like really like. No pressure. Just feel free to ignore me if not. But like you can grow a pretty big show by doing that. And I've talked to a few people who've grown like multi-million download shows who said like that's the work I did early on. Like getting the first few thousand people was like in the DMs, chatting with people, getting to know people, like pitching in a like non-slimy, pitchy way that where people don't feel they feel like they're being offered something that will benefit them.
Yes. All right. I know that I think we'll stick around for another 10, 15 minutes. If you're watching live and you want to ask a question on YouTube, feel free to put that in the chat. Let's get into some actual tactics, things that people can do to promote their podcast. As if they already have a show, if they have a brand new show, what are some of your go-tos that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I really think like if you're less than 1,000 listeners, maybe let's say less than 500, like probably you could be doing more one-to-one like connecting with people and like community engagement. And I think that is just the nice thing, kind of like I started this thought here, but like the nice thing is it's pure. The downside and the upside is that it's pure like one-to-one. It's like a linear like effort in, result out, which long-term marketing is you put a lot of effort in and you never see any result. And then like 3 years in, all of a sudden you have this like compound growth curve happening where it's growing exponentially, but you don't really see any of that for a long time. And so I think part of sustaining yourself early on is like, we're all motivated by growth to some extent. And so I think we need to like find ways to ensure that we're getting in front of people, and we can do that by all these things we just talked about. This kind of, I usually think of it as like legwork of just like hustling kind of, and like, okay, I'm going to be meeting people and I'm going to put myself in places where I'm around people who would like this. So early on, that's like 100% of where I'd focus. And because you got to like put in the time and start experimenting with any of those longer term marketing strategies, and they're going to take time to work anyway. Beyond
Yes.
that, then I would start looking at like who else has the audience that I want. And hopefully, like it's easy to look at that as competition, but
Yeah.
it's also this huge opportunity to say like, oh, they already have 5,000 people listening to their show, or on their email list or on their Instagram, or like whatever it is. Probably podcasting's a better place to start looking, because their audience is all podcast listeners, and start to say like, are there ways that we could collaborate together? Like maybe I could be a guest on their show. Maybe they don't take guests, but there's another way that we could collaborate in some way. We could do a live YouTube, show together, like we're doing today here, something like that, which is like off platform for both of you, where maybe neither of you takes guests, but you can come up with something else, a way to like do something together that brings both of your audiences, some exposure to the other person. And I think
Yes.
like a lot of times people, it is hard if you're small. If somebody has 5,000 people following them and you have 50, there's an
Yeah.
imbalance there. But I think that the audience exposure is not the only thing you have to offer. And so I think getting really clear on like, what is missing from their show that I could bring there? Is that something about my ideas or my personality, or like if there is something that hopefully you have to offer? And like if there isn't, like that's a big red flag, that like, well, why would anybody listen to the show if you aren't offering anything new that people can't get elsewhere? And so I think like
Yeah.
that's one of the for collaborations, when people don't have success, it's because there isn't anything that they actually have to pitch that is valuable to anyone else, and like either audience or like original ideas or insight or approach or whatever it is. But I mean, then you just need to like develop that and start like tweaking what you're doing and find out like, okay, where are the gaps? Like this person does this thing really well, but they don't do everything well, and they have to. If anybody who is successful ignores almost everything and is super focused in one area, and so that means
Yes.
that there's an opportunity for you to like, okay, they're going to own this bit, but I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this better than anyone else. And like that's when you start to realize that like competition kind of goes away, because everybody kind of finds their lanes, and then it's all just kind of additive, and you can all like overlap without kind of poaching each other's audiences, and kind of just spread it all around. So that would be the next thing I would look at, is look for other people who have those audiences.
Yes. Yes. Some practical tools you can use for this. Let me see if I can show you some things. Especially, we've got one question here. Catching up on cinema is the show. Movie reviews, 25 streams over 4 years. That's great. 300 uploads. Crowded genre. How does one break through? I think one of the places you can break through is to do some audience research. And again, I'm going to keep sharing all these things, all these tools and lessons from the startup world. But SparkToro is a really interesting research tool. You can get some free searches with the free plan, but movie reviews. So you can search by topic, and it's going to give you, hopefully this is a good demo here. It's going to give you what this audience talks about online, what hashtags they use, frequently used phrases, what social media accounts they follow, other kind of hidden, high engagement, hidden gem accounts, some websites they visit most, and they'll also even show you podcasts they listen to, press accounts they read, YouTube channels they listen to. So for, I think it's Asin Badger, for your show, Catching Up on Cinema, here's some things you should be thinking about, even if it's just to go and look at Kevin Smith's account and say, who's following him? Maybe I can engage with some of his topics. Maybe I should be following him from my podcast's Twitter account. What kind of topics and forums are they getting involved in? Maybe I should have some of these people on my podcast as a guest. One of the easiest ways to increase your downloads is to get somebody who already has an audience. Doesn't always work, but somebody who already has an audience, and have them on your show as a guest, right? Or if you can't get them on as a guest, use their name in your keywords of your episode title. So podcast search is very dumb, and often is just matching really kind of blunt keywords. And so if you had a show called Kevin Smith's Best Movies, or we review Kevin Smith's worst movies, people that are searching for Kevin Smith are more likely to find your show on one of the search engines. I have a blog post on that as well that I highly recommend you listen to, and do these searches yourself. Like, go and search for your keywords on Google Podcasts, on Spotify, on Apple. And then I would also take a look at these other search engines like Listen Notes, Podchaser, Good Pods, and Podacy. So Podacy is a hidden gem, I think. Not a lot of people know about it. It's an app with tons of podcast fans on it. And you can find topics, movie reviews. I guess this search is not great, but you can look for podcasts that relate to movie reviews and just see who's recommending these podcasts, who's talking about them. There's a feed for anybody who's a member where people are just recommending podcasts and talking about them. Get involved in these communities. Get involved in Podchaser if you're not there already. Use tools like SparkToro. Folks were looking for that to do some audience research. The other hidden one, of course, is Apple Podcasts gives you recommendations on what other shows people are listening to. So if you haven't already searched for your podcast, this was a podcast that someone asked me about on Reddit. And they're like, how do I get more listeners? I said, well, scroll to the bottom and see if there's any potential here to do a cross promo with any of these shows. Or again, to see where are these shows promoting themselves? Like, what ads are they running? Where are they? What are they doing here? You know, how are they promoting their own show? And you can also do a little bit of this by, you know, looking at SparkToro, looking up your competitors. So what was Welcome to Night Vale is a interesting one. So if we went back to SparkToro, you could search follows this social account. Let's go Welcome to Night Vale. Sorry, I'm nervous and I'm typing slowly.
You're doing great.
Let's see if we can find a Twitter account here. Let's do it on Twitter. Night Vale. But you can search for specific accounts, and then you can see what are they talking about on Twitter? Where are they promoting themselves? What are their top words in, you know, their bio? What, you know, who are these folks? And sometimes even just by following these people from your show's social account, you can create a connection, right? So
well, and the other thing, like what I would add on to that is like think about who follows a show. Like if your show has overlap with Welcome to the Night Vale, like think about who's following that Twitter account, and it's probably all of your potential listeners. So just like go engage with that account and make sure your Twitter profile or whatever platform you're on is optimized and says like something that like somebody who is aware of Welcome to Night Vale would go to your profile and be like, oh, this looks like it's similar to this thing I already like. And so, because we all do that. If you observe, you know, yourself when you're on social media, you like see somebody commented something that was interesting, and you like hover over their name, and it pops up their little profile, and you're like, oh, that person looks kind of interesting. I'm going to follow them. And so I think like just by being active in the comments of someone else, not by even creating any content yourself, you will get people like following you and aware of your show, and that like over time will trickle back into more listeners. And it's not always like an immediate thing, but I think with some genres, like that's the nice thing about more entertainment style shows is that people like you binge through a series, then you're like on to the next one. Whereas like for me, I listen to more educational stuff where it's like, I don't want to overload my too much. And so I have like a few shows that are just run for 10 years at a time. I'm not taking on as much new content. Whereas my partner, she listens to a ton of like true crime and cult shows and like all these things, and we'll binge through the 8 episode series, and then it's like, okay, where's my next fix? And so like people are actively looking for those. And so especially like this is actually, I'm just thinking of this strategy right now. I would, if there's a show that you know is a short run series that has some overlap with yours, I would really engage with that, especially as they're nearing the end of the season, when everybody who's
Yep.
following that is like sad that it's ending and they're looking for their next thing. And if you're really active there, not even promoting your show, it's just in your profile and you're just like one of the most active people engaging with that account wherever they're most active, a lot of those people are going to see you and they're going to click their way back to your profile and they're going to see your show and they're going to be like, oh, this is interesting. It's like, here's the next thing to fill that void now.
Yes. Yeah. And here's an example. You go to Reddit and you type in a search query, podcasts like Night Vale. And here's just tons of people asking, hey, what's another show like Night Vale? Now, you can't, are we still live? Sorry.
I think we are on
Somebody
YouTube. It
said-
looks like it ended on Twitch, maybe.
Okay. Podcasts, you can't promote yourself on a Reddit subreddit. You can't just show up and say, listen to my show. But if someone asks, hey, what's another show like Night Vale? You can be damn sure. You can go into the comments and say, hey, I run a show like that's very similar to Night Vale. Here's a trailer episode and link to your show. This is also why search engine optimization is such an opportunity. Podcasts like Night Vale. What's going to come up here? Well, look, Podyssey, that other app I just showed you, has a list here. So if you were a super user on Podyssey and involved in this community and you had a show like Night Vale, maybe they would have included you in this list and you would be top of Google right now, right? Community work, invest in community, be involved in all of these different areas. And also on your website, have a real podcast website where you might rank for a specific keyword, right? And I mean, I don't know, this is build a SaaS podcast. I don't know if mine will even show up on here. That'd be, but oh yeah, here we go. So I named my show Build Your SaaS because anybody who's looking to build a software as a service company is searching these keywords. And I want to be near the top when they search for those things. Yeah. All right. Do we have time for some more questions, Jeremy? How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm great. Yeah, we can go another 3 or 4 hours, I think.
All right. Let's see. Holy moly. Thanks for all these questions, guys. We'll get to as many of these as we can. Do you see any difference in doing weekly versus bi-weekly? Jeremy?
I think that this is such a like personal question. I think this is like an episode length question. How long should my episodes be? It's kind of like, what can you manage and do well? How much time do you have available? And so I think that one of the things that a mistake that they make is they say, well, I can produce an episode every week. That's no problem. But can you produce and promote and market an episode every week? Maybe not. Like I think most people, if you look at where the time that you have allocated to your podcast, if that's like 10 hours a week, how much of that is like what I think of as like maintenance tasks. I did a thread on this yesterday on Twitter, but like all these tasks that are necessary in order to get the show out. And I would include like content repurposing and like some of that kind of stuff as well, setting up the website, producing the show, all the admin, whatever. Like those are like maintenance tasks and they do not contribute to growth almost at all. They're still necessary because you need to get the show out there. You need to make the thing that you're going to promote, but they're not actively getting it in front of new people because most of the people on social media who are seeing your posts and everything are already aware of you. They're probably aware to some extent that you have a podcast. And so you're not really expanding that reach at all. And so like what I think of as growth oriented tasks are different tasks where that might be through collaborations, things like that, more one-to-one outreach, community engagement to kind of like get into a community that's not yours, where there are a bunch of other people who aren't already aware of you. Like that needs to be budgeted for as well. And so at that point, maybe you're like, actually, I can do way more marketing if I only do one episode every 2 weeks and dedicate the whole second week to just growth oriented tasks. And maybe your show grows quite a bit faster. I know some people like to talk about like, it's better for Apple's algorithm if you produce more episodes, which, there are certainly advantages to that. But I think for many shows, like if you don't really have a mass appeal show, I would almost say less is better, like fewer episodes and more time spent marketing and making connections.
Yes. And there's, again, all these rules of thumb are just invented. Like
Yeah.
hardcore history releases a new episode every 2 years. I don't know. Like, and when he releases a new episode, people listen because people love that show. So it
The same as
depends on the show.
Yeah, what we started this off with this show Brain. So the last episode
Yeah.
was April 6th. And like I literally check my feed every day, like maybe for sure every week, if not every day, and be like, I wonder when a new episode's coming out. And so I think a lot of times
Yeah.
people have a fear that like if I don't produce regularly enough, people are going to forget about me. This show, like it's in my feed and I think about it throughout the day. I'm like, man, when are they going to have a new episode? And the one before that was November 1st. So it's like
Yeah.
5 or 6 months in there, and they only have like 8 episodes, and it's good enough that I'm like, I've got the itch. I'm like, come on, guys, like get a new episode out there.
Yes. Yeah, totally. And this actually relates to the next question from Peter. Do you feel there's a big or small or no advantage to having and promoting something like Discord to go beyond the podcast episode for getting interaction? Here's my response. Sure, you could start a Discord. That might be the best thing for you to do. What I would think about is, what is your audience begging you for? So you can bring this up in an episode. Hey, folks, I'm thinking about starting a Discord. Would that be interesting to anyone? If that's interesting to you, could you just pause the podcast, go and get me on Twitter, and just reply to me and say, hey, I'm interested in that. And I think we are not using these calls to action inside of our podcast enough. Have a prompt. One of my favorite prompts to start experimenting with this is, now I've probably lost it, but I'll just ask people, I'll just say, hey, everybody, I'm just going to take a break and say, if you're listening right now, like if you're walking the dog or doing the dishes, can you just go to Twitter and say, I'm listening? Sometimes podcasting's lonely, and I just love to hear if anyone's out there. And I do that, and people respond, right? They actually respond and engage. So a prompt like, hey, should we have a Discord, is great, because it's a lot of work to pause the podcast or to remember while you're driving at the end to then message somebody and say, yes, I absolutely want a Discord. So like every message you get, it's likely there was 10 or 20 or 30 people that wanted to and just didn't get to it. So those responses are so invaluable. I actually, these days, I base how I'm feeling about the podcast on my response rate. So number of downloads, sure, that's fine. But how many people responded? The only way you're going to get people to respond is to have one ask every episode. Hey, folks, if you're listening right now, go and message me on Facebook and tell me your favorite color or whatever. That's response rate is kind of how I measure, was this successful or not? So yeah, if people are asking for Discord, do it.
Yeah, that's also like for me with my newsletter, it's like because newsletter's a bit different, and you can look at your open rate, which is essentially just a test of like your subject line. And so it's not necessarily like, did people enjoy the article? But I kind of like look at, usually I get like maybe between like 3 to 7. I remember, I don't know if anybody knows Ann Handley, the writer. She's got a great newsletter and has a company called Marketing Profs, I think. But she, at her 100th issue, she gave this list of tactics. She has like a 40,000 person newsletter, something like that, and said like that was her one like metric that she cared about. And I was like, oh, that's actually really good. And she gets like 100 responses each issue, and I get like 4 to 7. But if I get more than that, I'm like, oh, this one was like a hit. And if I get less than that, if I get 0, I'm like, that one was off. And it doesn't really, that's like the sign. And you don't, the interesting thing for me is like, you don't need hundreds of data points. It's like, oh, I know my benchmark is 3 people email me every week, or 3 people give me a DM when I say that. If it's more, this was a better episode. If it was less, I missed something here. So I really love that. And I love your thing about like, what's your favorite color? I almost think that actually gets more engagement because there's this like pattern interrupt going on where people are like, wait, what? Like that has nothing to do with the show. It breaks this like idea of like, what was your favorite takeaway from this episode? Which everybody's just like, I've heard that a bazillion times and tuned it out. But like my favorite color, like that's kind of fun. Like I'm going to go do that.
And to make it a recurring bit. So Noah Kagan at the end of every episode, And the listeners like this pattern. They like the familiarity of recurring bits. And like you can just expect, like, it's like a talk show has a monologue, and then they have a guest, and then they have a break, and then they have another guest, and then they have a musical guest. That's the pattern of the show. At the end of every episode, Noah Kagan just throws out a weird question for people to answer. And he always pauses, what's your favorite burrito topping? And that becomes a way of engaging with the audience, right? So have these repeating bits in your show. Again, if you're just starting out, you might not get responses for a while, but it's good to get into practice of doing these things. And one day, it's going to be the best feeling in the world. A listener that you don't know is going to show up in your inbox or your Twitter DMs or your Instagram DMs or whatever and say, oh, hey, my favorite burrito topping is pulled pork, and you're going to be ecstatic. All right, we're going to keep going here. Jeremy and I are too passionate about this. We just keep talking so much.
When you gave the outline for what we're going to talk about today, I was like, oh, I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of that.
I don't know if we're going to get
sitting
through those,
here.
Yeah. How much can repurposing your podcast contribute to your success? Tons. Repurpose it everywhere. Repurpose it in your newsletter. Repurpose it video. I think people are sharing the wrong types of video clips. I think those audiograms are okay, but I'm seeing way more engagement on something like this, where you record the episode the way Jeremy and I are doing, but you just post a little, whatever this was. This was a 1-minute clip, and this had 5,000 views. And then I linked to the episode. Did I link to it after this? Yeah, so listen here. So I just tweet out the video clip. Here's why you might want to listen. It's engaging. It works with this particular platform, right? You see video on Twitter and you might engage with it. It gets shared and you're giving them a little nugget for free, and then they can listen all of these places. So I think repurpose your content everywhere. One of the benefits of repurposing is accessibility. I think you asked about that as well in this question. So I'm uploading transcripts to my podcast anyway, because I'm already transcribing it everywhere for newsletters, for subtitles on videos. Having a workflow where you're pulling in your audio into Descript, which is what I use, and then you get the transcript, and then you can search for that one clip that you want to share. You can highlight it. You can export it as video, upload it to different places to promote the podcast, and then also upload that transcript when you're uploading your episode. Anything else you want to say about repurposing?
I would just say, look up. So this is actually, we're giving SparkToro all kinds of free exposure here, but they have a blog post, and it was written by their VP of marketing, Amanda Natividad. She's like one of the best follows on Twitter as well. So certainly follow her.
Yes.
And so she posted a tweet about this, tweet thread about this, but then also it's a full blog post, and it's this idea called zero-click content. And so I think the idea behind it is build or create platform native content so that it looks like it belongs wherever you're repurposing it. And so people don't do this because it's more work. And the result is that you put a minimal amount of work into something that does absolutely nothing. And so kind of you're actually wasting more time by trying to save time, because you only put in 15 minutes to repurposing your content, or 30 minutes or an hour, whatever it is, but it actually has zero potential of doing anything for you. And so it's pure waste. Whereas maybe if you took 2 hours and repurposed it really well, or maybe just took that same hour that you were spending on content repurposing, and instead of doing it for Instagram and LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter and creating all these assets to just blast everywhere, you just said, okay, I'm going to take the same hour and I'm just going to write one really great Twitter thread. And that's what I'm going to do with that hour. And it's platform native. People don't actually need to click away to the podcast. The idea is that it's valuable where it is on that platform. And maybe there's like a final additional tweet that's like, hey, if you wanted to go into more depth, like you can get this here, but you've already given away the goods kind of in the tweet. And so people, like, that's how you grow on social faster. And also, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of getting your like first positive interaction with a person, where you kind of like, they see that you go out of your way to help them in some way without making an ask of them. And I think we all note that. And somebody like gives you a really thoughtful response on social media, you're like, wow, that was like, it's not normal. That's not how we generally interact with social.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can
Yeah.
do that for 10 people a day pretty easily if you're
Yeah.
in a community and around those people. And all of a sudden, not all of those people are going to come back to your show immediately, but you keep doing that every day. And like 6 months later, all of a sudden you've got a steady stream of people who are like now aware of you. They like you. They also are aware of the show, and they're kind of like trickling in that way. And I think a part of that is just like, not trying to just like pull people off platform all the time, because the social media platforms don't really encourage you to
Yeah.
do that anyway, and they suppress your posts. But then you're also just
Yeah.
building goodwill with people like where they're already engaging.
Yes. I love this. I love this because it actually recognizes how humans behave.
Yeah.
So I've interacted with someone forever on Twitter. Eventually, I read one of their blog posts. I'm about to go on a big airplane trip and I'm looking for podcasts. I'm like, oh, yeah, Jeremy has a podcast. And then I search it up before I get on the plane and download a few episodes. That's how podcast discovery works in the real world. People think it's this really short funnel, and sometimes it is, but more often it's a long funnel, right? How come Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend is such a popular show? Well, he's got like a 3-decade long funnel that leads to the podcast, right? It takes time. You're investing in these moments, everything that happens before someone might subscribe.
Yeah, I just shared a link in the chat here. Actually can't remember her name now. She sold her business that this blog is on. The blog is ittybiz.com. And this post, it breaks it down as clearly as possible, like how people actually follow you back to your platform. And it's so refreshing to like be able to position yourself and like, oh yeah, because you like guest on somebody else's podcast and you like get 3 new people to yours, and you might not even be able to track that. And you're like, oh, I guess this strategy doesn't work. And what she kind of says there is like, well, actually, like, what do you do when you hear somebody great on a podcast? You're like, wow, that person was super smart. And then you just like
Yeah.
forget about them entirely. And then like 4 months later, you hear them on another podcast and you're like, oh man, that person, like, wow, they were really smart again. And then you like move on to the next show and you forget about them again. And then at some point they've heard you like 5 or 6 times and they're finally like, okay, every interaction I've had with this person is amazing. Why am I not listening to their show yet? And so you kind of need to like
Yes.
build up this critical mass of like people in your space. And like all of a sudden, that's I think why practically the compound effect happens, is because there's this whole time where you're like doing all the work and not seeing any of it. And then you hit this critical mass and all of a sudden like everybody's kind of aware of you, and they have enough touch points that they're like, oh, I know that person already. I know that they're smart. I know that I like their content, the way they think. And now here's this one prompt at the perfect time, the same post you've done every week for like 2 years. All of a sudden, that's the thing that's like, oh yeah, like now the time is right for me that I'm gonna go listen to their show finally.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Um, okay, let's get on to. So we have next question. Sorry. Uh, I don't get over 40 downloads per episode, and I've been at it for a year. I'm ready to take the next step for growth. What is it for someone at such a beginner stage? And I looked this podcast up. It's Women Waken, and I think in this case, if this is your show, licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in substance abuse, addiction, eating disorders, and trauma. What I would do if I was you is I would be searching for those terms and finding newsletters and blog posts, sites that are writing about that, and I would pitch them on doing a guest post. And at the end of the guest post, almost always you get a little bio with a link. That's usually the trade-off. The trade is that you get to link to something that you've done. And you could also reference your podcast in those posts. But I would be, because you're an expert, I would be reaching out to folks as an expert and saying, hey, I'd love to help write an article on this, or I can write a little blurb for your newsletter. A lot of these places are looking for content, and then referencing your podcast in the article about solutions. So, hey, in this episode, I interviewed this person and they had a really great quote on whatever. And that's going to help build up the awareness of your show. People who are searching for that, so they have intent-based searches. They're struggling with maybe one of these problems and they need solutions. The next step might be, I'm going to read an article and then I'm going to listen to a podcast, or I'm going to subscribe to this expert's podcast because I trust them. I would also say you're missing some opportunity with the title of your podcast, the Woman Awaken podcast. And this is really more on the app side. It's not your fault. It's Google, Apple, and Spotify's fault. But they match podcast titles more than descriptions for some reason. And they match episode titles more than episode descriptions. And so having keywords that people might be searching for in either your podcast title, not always possible, and your episode title could really help people that are searching for those topics. And I know I've done that, especially with self-help, psychology, those kinds of topics. Sometimes I'll be like, okay, let me just find an episode about this topic, and I'll find shows that way. So make sure that you are using those keywords. But I think partnerships with sites that are already doing that work might really help. Anything else, Jeremy?
Yeah, I would add like guesting on other shows, because you're an expert. That's an easy kind of like for a lot of people, that's not actually an option. If they're not really an expert, it's harder to find guesting opportunities. But because you are, there are probably other shows that cover similar topics. But I would so those are the tempting shows where it's like you're kind of competitors and potential collaborators as well. But what I like to do is look for kind of like shoulder audiences, kind of where maybe they've never had somebody like you on the show before. They've never covered the topic of what you specialize in. And so you go on that show, and it's an easier pitch because they haven't got a ton of people pitching that already. They haven't covered that content so much. And all of a sudden, like in their audience's eyes, you're like the one and only person who does this thing and who is an expert about this. And so all of a sudden, like, even though you're probably not the number one world authority on the topic, to this certain group of people, you kind of are. And so I think that there's a bit of like mental gymnastics to like think outside the box and understand like, okay, who are these audiences? And so did you have what was the description again, Justin?
Of the podcast?
Yeah.
It's the Woman Awaken podcast is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in substance abuse, addiction, eating disorders, and trauma.
Okay, so like I would think, obviously you're going to be wanting to get in front of, well, I assume with the title, in front of women, but I would not think of like necessarily even people who are already looking for this. And I think especially with your topic, I imagine people go through a process of like, maybe it's not denial, but like the problem is there, but they're not actively looking for it yet. And I think that's a great place for you to get in front of them. And so you probably know, what are the situations that lead people to struggle with these types of things? Is that like, demanding careers or things like that? And like maybe you actually want to pitch business podcasts for women, and like this is well outside their like typical subject matter, but a big portion of the audience probably is not talking about these things and is having, these problems are brewing kind of, if they've not already kind of manifested in some way. And so I think that's where you can kind of like get ahead of the curve, and you also have very little competition, as long as you can like craft a compelling pitch and make it clear like why this is the perfect thing for that show's audience. So that would be where I would probably start.
I love that. Yeah, those kind of adjacent opportunities. And we briefly mentioned Listen Notes, but Listen Notes, of all my tests, was the best search engine for podcasts. And I just typed in business podcast for women. But you will get lots of sample shows and episodes. And like Jeremy's saying, you could reach out to these folks and say, hey, I'm an expert, and your show's, for women who are in business, but everybody deals with mental health issues. Do you want to do an episode on that? And you might get some traction that way. All right, let's keep going. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. Thanks for sticking with this, Jeremy.
Yeah, could go all day.
Let's see here. Going back up, YouTube full episodes or shorts. I'm in favor of just uploading clips to YouTube. But it really depends on your audience. If your audience loves watching full episodes on YouTube, then upload it. And I've been testing this out. I'll upload full episodes. Actually, what I do first is I upload clips, And I only upload the full episode if people ask me for it. And
Hmm.
so I start with the clips because they're great for promotion. I'll upload them to YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And then they become these kind of atomic units that get shared around. And then, yeah, if people are asking me for the full video, I'll upload the full video. But I've personally found those short clips are more effective at getting people to take out their phone, search for my show on their podcast app, and subscribe. So if you want audio listeners, that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, and I would with the this is partially you need to lean into this in like pre-production when you're developing your topics for the show, but hopefully this is a good strategy to employ anyway. But like thinking in advance, like what might somebody, okay, we're going to be talking about this broad topic. What are the specific things people might ask and search for? And if you can then tailor those clips so that somebody goes into YouTube and searches for like, how do I do this? And your clip comes up and it's like very,
Yes.
precisely like you've clipped it. So it's just, they get a concise answer to that question. I think there's a big
Yeah.
opportunity for that as well to like, then maybe you have like 5 questions like that that are searchable kind of queries in the show. And all of a sudden you've got like 5 new ways for people to find you and get that first impression.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Uh, so let's see here. We launched in May this year. We have 114 to 379 downloads per episode. But as I mentioned, I'm weighing these metrics too much as they don't mean listen to. Yeah, so actually, that downloads versus streams thing, you're right. Some people could be downloading the show and not listening to it. The fact that they're still subscribed, I think, is a worthy metric in of itself. I'm a huge Mark Maron fan. I don't listen to every episode, but I'm still subscribed, and I still listen probably once a month. Most podcast apps now are not automatically downloading. Like Apple Podcasts will not automatically download episodes if you haven't been an active listener. And so that old feeling of, while people are downloading but not listening, I think that's actually going away. Whatever the metric is, whether it's downloads or streams, you can take it as one number. And again, sure, focus on the numbers. Feel like, yeah, I'd love to have more listeners. And if 300 downloads per episode means, oh, maybe I had 200 people listen to the episode, that's great. Keep thinking about it in terms of listeners. How can I attract more listeners? And if you're really looking for a metric to give you a sense of how many people are engaged, response rate. Give people a prompt and see how many people respond. We're in perhaps one of the most saturated podcasts. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go your question. I just saw one from Arvid call here. Didn't see you before. He asked if we'd both come on his show. Should he transition it to a solo show or from a solo show to an interview? And would we both come on? I love Arvid's show
Yeah.
as it is, but I would be happy to come on as a guest if you do make the transition.
Oh yeah, for sure. I would too. Yeah, Arvid's great. Arvid's a great example of engaging community for his show.
Speaking of building in public, master.
Yes, absolutely. What is an efficient paid advertising route to get ears? Do they exist? I don't know. Have you found it? I haven't found any paid channels that really work awesome. So, but I suppose it depends on the show. What have you found, Jeremy?
Yeah, so all my experience is in hearing from other people because I haven't done any of it myself, but I have seen, so I don't know if people know Tanner Campbell. He's the only person that I know who has personally shared like having a lot of success with Facebook ads specifically. And I don't know if his course is still available. I took it like a year ago and it was really interesting. Like I'm a novice to not even into mediocre Facebook ads person, whatever, like above novices that I know my way around the platform and don't know much more than that. But I've been around Facebook ads enough that I kind of like understand how it works and use it, decently effectively. But his targeting strategies were really interesting. So like if his course is still available, look into that. And he seems to have had a lot of success, both for his own shows as well as client shows. But that there's a lot of dependence on your niche as well. Like one of the things it's kind of like frustrating for me with Facebook ads is like podcasting or as an interest category, like reaching podcasters is really hard to do through Facebook because it's not a big enough. I mean, I don't understand. It can't be that it's not a big enough community because there's tons of podcast listeners and podcasters and whatever. But
Yeah.
depending on your niche, that might not be a route. The other one I know I've heard Jay Klaus talk about, which is he's done a bunch of experimenting with ads, in-app ads. And I know Jordan Harbinger has done, he talks a lot about that. But I think the thing you have to be careful of is where those two are great examples. Jordan Harbinger has a huge show that has like many millions of downloads. And he is selling, I mean, Jay Klaus is also selling CPM downloads, which makes that more attractive than if you have a business where you need engaged, qualified people who are actually going to stick around. And one of the things I've heard from a lot of people who do in-app podcast ads is that they're not high quality subscribers. And so you can pay to get them if you have promised like an advertiser that you're going to guarantee them 10,000 downloads an episode, and you're kind of like around 9,000, you're like, I got to get some new listeners over the next month. Like that's where those ads start to make more sense. But if you're looking for like engaged listeners who stay with the show, everything I've seen from in-app ads at least is that you stop paying and they dwindle pretty quickly and you go back to where you were. Maybe you get a few more people. So maybe like reach out to Tanner, see if he has that course available. He's a pretty big advocate of it, and I can't really say because I haven't done it myself, but in going through his course, it's like a great course too. It's like super quick watch. It opened my eyes to a lot of opportunities that I wasn't thinking of how you would actually do it smartly when it comes to using Facebook to promote. So that would be my thought. And the one other one I would say is like that I would look into more is advertising on other podcasts, because unfortunately many podcasts undervalue their worth. And so you can get some pretty great deals out there. And actually the one other one that I'll add that I do a lot for my newsletter is advertising in niche newsletters, which is often also very cheap.
Yeah. I'd recommend looking at this Jordan Harbinger case study on, he basically built his audience buying ads on other shows. And I think that can be a really effective strategy. Some ways just follow what Jordan's doing. He's also sponsoring the Podyssey newsletter. So, you know, these things work for him. They could work for you as well, finding newsletters or podcasts to promote on if you're interested in paid acquisition.
Yep. And like that's the other thing. I know Ariel Nissenblatt and Lauren Passell talk about this a lot, but like there are tons of podcast discovery newsletters. And so those sometimes they do have like paid placements, but you can also just pitch your show and get included on lists that go out to, you know, sometimes many thousands of people. And that's like there's some effort involved, but I think like one of the best things you can do is just start pitching your show to a variety of different people and understand that like your pitches probably aren't going to be that great at the start, but the more you do it, the better they're going to get, the more opportunities you kind of open up, and you learn how to talk about your show better. And you can also like, you pitch one newsletter once and they say no, or they don't include it. You can do it again in 3 months or 6 months when you have something that's like relevant for them. So that would be a non-paid, but there's some overlap there. You can either pay in a lot of these routes for podcast newsletters, or you can just pitch them and say like, hey, is this worthy of being included in what you're doing?
Okay. This is, I think we may have missed a few, but I think let's end with this question here. What are your top 3 strategies for those of us just starting to launch their podcast? I started one just this week with Transistor. Hey, thanks for using Transistor. I have so many ideas for my episodes, but I would appreciate with your advice on what to focus on the startup stage. I'll give you my 3, and we'll see if Jeremy's got a different 3. Number 1, record a compelling trailer, make it 30 seconds to a minute long, and upload it right away. Make the quality of that trailer really good. That is your advertisement for your show. The sooner you get that on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, all of the platforms, the better. You can't submit to the platforms until you have at least one episode published in your feed. And that is just an underrated way to start talking about your show, to share, hey, I'm a brand new podcaster and I just released my first trailer. I would love it if you listen to it. Also publish it on YouTube and make it personal. Like I would have a talking head video where I talk with maybe a little bit of B-roll, again, 30 seconds to a minute long, and you can share that as well and start getting people to subscribe or follow the show on all of the different platforms. Why don't we go back and forth, Jeremy? What's another strategy?
Yeah, so I would actually build on that and say yes to the teaser. And the other thing about teasers is the great thing about them is they're a great marketing asset forever. And so I think like it's if you do a good job of the teaser, you can always share that. You can be 100 episodes in and it can still be relevant to the show and a great entry point where people, if you're reaching out to people and you're saying like, hey, here's whether it's guests or potential listeners, say like, hey, here's a little like sample of what it's like, so you can get an idea if this is something that's interesting to you. And they are going to make a decision based on that of like, I've listened to a 2-minute teaser. Did that entice me enough to listen through a 40-minute episode or however long your episode is? So like understand that that's part of the calculation that's happening there. But
yes,
beyond that, you mentioned quality and like make the teaser good quality. The other thing I would say, like, do not underestimate the importance of good, well-designed cover art. And this is another thing, like this is the first impression that people are getting of your show. And we don't realize we're doing it, but we are all judging everything that comes across our feeds based on what we can see. The information we have available dictates whether we're going to take that next step. So the first thing we often see is title and cover art. So does the title resonate with me, or does it like show that, hey, this is a show that is for someone like me and the show's going to like solve a problem I have, or do that to kind of bring this full circle, like do that job that I need done in some way. So there's the title, and then there's the cover art, which sends this idea of legitimacy. And the show might be amazingly produced audio, but if the cover art isn't looking that great, based on the information that we have available, we think, oh, this is an amateur show, this person's cutting corners. Probably the show is not that great. And even if it is, we know that there are, dozens of other shows out there that are all vying for our attention. And so if we see another one of those in a directory or something like that, our eyes are going to that one. This looks like the safest bet for my next, 40 minutes of time. I'm going with that one, and I'm never giving any of the other ones a shot. So I would say if save up, like if you need to save up, if you don't have the money now, like it is such an important part of the show, kind of like listener acquisition process.
Totally. 2 resources there. I think this tool still works. I coded this one, so if it doesn't work, then. But transistor.fm/preview allows you to upload your cover art and your show title. And so if I click preview, that's my title and my show art, and then I get to put in rollerblading as the topic. And this will ping Apple's podcast directory and quickly allow you to compare your artwork to other shows in that niche. And so side-by-side comparison, I like this because it's a blunt keyword search, rollerblading, and then I just get basically the top results from Apple Podcasts. And then right away I can say, how does mine compare to these ones? And actually, in my case, I think it's pretty good. And you can also do tests on this. I would screenshot this and start just showing it to people. Hey, which podcast would you choose first if you'd search for this, just based on the cover art and the name? So transistor.fm/preview. What was the other resource I was going to show people? Canva is a great tool for creating podcast cover art. That's how I do almost all my stuff. It's super intuitive. You can start with other templates and modify them really quickly. I'm not affiliated with them, but that's the product I use for coming up with cover art all the time. So, and then the last recommendation I'll give there is on the Transistor YouTube channel. Search Transistor Podcast Teardowns. I have a whole playlist where I just do teardowns on people's branding and packaging, show art, descriptions, and I show how it looks in Spotify and why it matters and all that stuff. So search for that too. Lots of good resources there. What's another and my other tip for getting started is start a email list, a waiting list right away. Start an email list and then create an autoresponder or an auto welcome message that says something like, what brought you here today? And the idea is to immediately ask people, hey, it's Justin. I'm starting this podcast. Thanks so much for being interested. I'm just curious, what's going on in your life that brought you here today? Or what made you want to sign up for the waiting list for this podcast? Because then you're going to figure out what's motivating to them. Mm-hmm. Oh, Night Vale just ended, and I want another show like Night Vale. Or, oh, I've been following your work forever on Twitter. I wanted to see what was up with your podcast. Or, oh, I'm starting a software company next month, and I just wanted information on how to best do that. So create that waiting list, create an automatic welcome email that asks people a question. And again, you might get 10 people sign up, but the conversations you're going to have based on that automatic question are going to be invaluable. And now you've got some fans in your court that are giving you feedback that you can even email personally and say, hey, what do you think about this show art? And let them give you feedback on that. Or, hey, I just launched it and I don't have a lot of fans, but if you could like listen to it and give it a review, that'd be great. Waiting list is an underrated asset, and I think every podcast should have one.
Yep. Yeah, and I know Jay Klaus, bringing him up again, because he's a really smart guy when it comes to podcasting and has had a lot of success. His question for every new person who signs up to his email list is, if I could dedicate an episode of the podcast just to you, what would it be about? Which I really love that take on the question as well.
Yes. Perfect. Before we leave, Jeremy, anything else you'd like to say on podcast marketing?
Well, it's kind of maybe like rounding out this this question, but also maybe wrapping up the entire conversation, is this idea that like marketing is such a long game. Like there is no single thing you can do that will make you successful. And so I think for me, what I think when you are not when you don't have much experience with marketing and your whole experience of marketing is like advertising essentially. So like Super Bowl ads and billboards and like all the stuff you see big companies doing and you think that's marketing, like none of us are ever going to do anything like that. I mean, maybe hopefully we'll get to the point where we can buy Super Bowl ads, all of us, for our shows and newsletters and all that kind of stuff. But that's a bit of a long shot. And so I think realizing that is an important milestone in understanding that like, okay, there's a few things here. There's like understanding I need to do marketing, understanding that marketing for me does not look the same as Coca-Cola. And so then what kind of follows from that is this idea that I think we need to like make marketing something we actually enjoy and that's manageable. Because I think so much of it is so overwhelming. Like everybody's saying like you need to do this and this and this and this and this. And I think that just like gets us scared to do any kind of marketing off the bat. And so for me, what's really worked for me, and I know a lot of people that I've worked with, is like there are enough tactics and strategies out there that there is one that actually would feel good and would be fun and that would actually like energize you in a way. And so I think like being able to say no to most things and like one great marketing strategy is enough. And if it's something that takes you like, even if that's like 5 to 10 minutes a day of like engaging in this one community, and you just like, that's where you make all your connections and good things seem to happen. You meet collaborators, you find listeners, like that's totally possible. And I know a lot of people who've like built businesses and shows and creative platforms through doing that, like just showing up in one place every day, not doing any of these other like fancy strategies. And it's like, that's the place where like they would show up there even if they didn't have something like to capture people in like a podcast or newsletter. And so I think like finding that thing for you where it's more like a marketing practice, where it's just like a thing I do every day and will always do because why wouldn't I? It's fulfilling and kind of generative in and of itself. I think like finding that thing, and you're going to need to go through a bunch of those, like that's when things really start to work for you.
Yes. Yeah, that's so well said. Folks,
what about you?
I'm going to look at
any final thought?
Well, yeah, the final thought is I'm going to look at the camera and I'm going to say, obviously, look, Jeremy could not even fit all of his wisdom. He's an overflowing fount of wisdom, and I'm a huge fan of what he's doing. Go and follow him on Twitter. I am Jeremy Enns, and check out this right here, counterweightcreative.co/minimalist-podcast-marketing-method. If you Google this, you'll find it. He has so much to share, and he's doing this. This is a free workshop, right?
Yep. Yeah. Week and a half from now, 2 weeks from now.
Yes. Sign up for this. Jeremy also has a course that you should check out. Just go find him online, Jeremy Enns. Sign up for all of his things. I'm a huge fan. We'll try to do this again. And I think we shared all these resources and stuff. I think what I'll do is I'll publish a newsletter with all the links and all of the resources and a kind of succinct video summary of everything we talked about. So transistor.fm/newsletter. I want to thank everybody who showed up and watched us live. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It means so much to have interactivity while we're doing this. And I think we got to do one of these again, Jeremy.
I think so.
It honestly feels like we just scratched the surface. I think more exposure to these kinds of ideas is how you're going to get better at it. And so being exposed to some ideas, going away and trying a few out, and then coming back and then having another session with Jeremy and I, and then going again, that might be the way to do it. If you need more help right now, just reach out to Jeremy right now. He's available for, I don't know if you're still doing one-on-one coaching, but workshops, coaching, his course, and yeah, feel free to DM me as well on Twitter. I'm the letter M, the letter I, Justin, or you can just head to Transistor and hit this little blue chat box, and we're a small company. We'd be happy to answer all your questions. But yeah, thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Jeremy, for showing up in the evening. It's dark where you're at.
Yeah, it's slowly gotten darker over the past couple hours. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
In the chat, honestly, thanks everybody, and thanks for the encouragement. These kind words, it means so much to both of us.